He lived in complete seclusion for decades, and armed with only a player piano, wrote some of the most complicated music ever. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Conlon Nancarrow. Samuel Conlon Nancarrow was born in Texarkana, Arkansas in October 1912. So, fun fact, he shares a hometown with Scott Joplin. The family enjoyed music, but only Conlon and his brother Charles played anything. Conlon first on the piano before switching to trumpet, which he was really good at. Unlike the piano, he apparently didn't have a very good teacher. He had a fierce independent streak from his earliest days. His parents felt he needed to go off to a military boarding prep school in Illinois, but the only thing that did was expose Conlon to jazz, and at Interlochen the following summer, he decided to dedicate his life to music. His parents were not happy about any of this. He was supposed to be an engineer, so off he went to Vanderbilt University at the ripe old age of 15, an experience that lasted all of one semester. He bounced around hither and thither across the eastern half of the continental United States, marrying his first wife, Helen, when she was 16 and he was either 19 or 20. This wouldn't last. Notice how I said first wife there, but Nancarrow wasn't fond of listening to others, and so he refused to go along with his parents' entreaties to annul the thing. The Nancarrows moved to Boston in the mid-30s, where Conlon studied the short-lived Malkin Conservatory with conductor Arthur Fiedler, and composition with Walter Piston, Nicholas Slonimsky, who later liked telling people that he discovered Nancarrow, and Roger Sessions. In Nancarrow's later telling, Sessions was a taskmaster who didn't give composition lessons as much as counterpoint exercises. And though he wished Sessions would, look at all his original compositions he'd bring in, Nancarrow really did feel like the counterpoint was important in a lot of his later work. Harmony, in the sense of a confluence of notes, just kind of happens as an incidental fact of much of his music. Woe betide those who attempt harmonic analysis on Nancarrow's pieces. In Boston, at the height of the Great Depression, Nancarrow got involved in communist politics and was employed by the Works Progress Administration as a conductor, which he was bad at, and as a composer, whose scores for plays kept getting thrown out. His only musical success was at the trumpet. He got his chops back just enough to play with a touring jazz band across Europe in 1936, which took him, among other places, to Nazi Germany. The following year, Nancarrow went back to Europe, this time for war. He joined the Lincoln Battalion, one part of the many international brigades organized by the Soviet Union to fight against Franco's nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. And for 2 years, Nancarrow suffered brutal conditions on the front lines, from exhaustion, diseases, and at least one shrapnel wound in his neck, an injury that made it back stateside as news of his death. He managed to escape Spain at the end of the war, and he made it back to Texarkana. The locals, in Nancarrow's later telling, didn't have any clue about what the Spanish Civil War was really about, and so they hailed him as a hero because they thought he was off fighting the Catholics. I mean, I guess they weren't totally wrong.
Into exile. I must go.
In Europe, Nancarrow's political attitudes shifted. Still avowedly a man of the left, he'd seen too much of what dictatorial, bureaucratic, Soviet-style communism entailed, and from then on, he always called himself a democratic socialist. As soon as his mom helped him recover from malnutrition, he was off to New York for a brief but important era. New York was the hub of new American music of all stripes, many of whom, like Aaron Copland and the fantastically named Wallingford Rieger, also leaned left. Rieger was so committed, he tried to talk Nancarrow back into the Communist Party. Between his new music colleagues and his friends from the Lincoln Battalion, he learned that the United States government wasn't being very kind to anyone even suspected of communist sympathies, let alone outright Communist Party affiliations. Party membership put a mark on your head. Specifically, no one he knew from those circles got their passport applications approved. He tried too. and he failed.
You didn't file your paperwork last night.
At that time, only Canada and Mexico allowed entry to U.S. citizens without passports, so in 1940, he went off to live in Mexico City, where he'd lived for the rest of his years. His early years in the Mexican capital were a series of eccentric living arrangements, as Nancarrow scrapped and saved what little he could and took odd jobs, always outside of music. He became a Mexican citizen in either 1955 or 1956. Sources differ, but the more recent ones I've found say 55 for what it's worth. When he was in Spain, Slanimsky had one of Nancarrow's pieces published in Henry Cowell's New Music Journal. Its founder incarcerated at the time on, let's call it Jeffrey Epstein behavior, and this turned some heads. But performances were few, far between, and usually terrible. A 1940 septet was supposed to be done in New York on the back of 2 sparsely attended rehearsals, but it wasn't enough. He didn't have much success in Mexico either. He'd become friends with the Spanish expatriate composer Rodolfo Hafter, absolute typo of a name, who asked Nancarrow for a trio. And then that didn't even get done because the clarinetist just refused to play it. The trio is chock full of canonical devices and shows that Nancarrow was concerned with making his canons audible through the use of recognizable gestures. After the septet and trio debacles, Nancarrow tried to get his first string quartet into the hands of the Budapest-based Lehner Quartet, which disbanded in 1948 and lost the score in the process. It would stay lost for over 30 years when the original manuscript turned up in Nancarrow's studio. Not the most organized dude, I admit. For what it was worth, it seemed like his career was going nowhere fast. But Nancarrow had a plan. He wanted to run an end around on his performers, and this plan was in the works for the better part of a decade before he got the money to pursue it. In 1947, Nancarrow became eligible for his dad's trust fund. He remembered the player piano from his childhood at home and his fascination with how the keys would move without a human to move them. Nancarrow used some of the trust fund money to travel back to New York, buy a player piano, buy a machine that could punch holes in player piano rolls, and somehow have all that transported back to Mexico City. Easy peasy, right?
It's incredibly hard.
These things were hulking pieces of analog technology, and Nancarrow knew nothing about the business of player pianos or even how rolls were produced. So he walked into the headquarters of QRS, a roll manufacturer, and found a machinist in the city who could copy QRS's design. The machinist quoted Nancarrow the equivalent of about $4,200 in today's money, and even then the work was so tedious, the machinist told Nancarrow that if anyone asked him to reproduce a punching machine ever again, he had no idea what he would charge. The project took over a month, and Nancarrow stuck around in the city long enough to go home with a new wife. Poor Helen had divorced him in 1940. They'd fully lost contact when Conlon was in Spain, and I think she thought he was dead. Like, I would assume that too if I'd literally been ghosted and also everyone else said that you were dead. Nancarrow was only married to Annette Margolis for 5 years, but those 5 years were pivotal. She had inherited some property in Mexico City through a previous marriage, and then Nancarrow would go on to get half of that when they split. This left Nancarrow with a small composing nook that would, in time, transform into a sanctum of mechanical music and 2 libraries. That seems excessive. Like, I only have 1. Even then, it's like only half of one. The other side of the room's all my wife's theology stuff. Eventually, Nancarrow got all of his tech set up in his new studio. But the question remains, why do any of this? Why go to these lengths? Why did he feel the need to use an instrument best associated with Edwardian parlors and Looney Tunes gags?
I wish my brother George was here.
To answer this, we're going to have to go back a little bit. Like almost every American composer of his generation, Nancarrow loved Henry Cowell's book, New Musical Resources. Cowell's contribution wasn't really cataloging the techniques of contemporary composition. It was proposing new avenues of musical development. And Cowell focused a lot on rhythm. He not uniquely felt that the harmonic, melodic, and timbral development of 20th century music implied an equal amount of rhythmic development. The problem is that human performers don't like playing weird and complicated rhythms. Cowell's only experiments in the genre weren't playable until they invented click tracks. Cowell himself said that it could only be properly done on a player piano. Nancarrow was mystified that Cowell, who otherwise composed what he preached, didn't write player piano music. But I don't think he should have been, because getting new music into player piano format presents considerable challenges. If you go into a digital audio workstation like GarageBand, Logic, Pro Tools, Ableton, any one of dozens of programs like that, you'll be able to toggle a piano roll editor, where the notes that go in are represented by bars that last as long as the note is on. This digital visual representation descends from its analog ancestor, the piano roll, a sheet of paper with holes punched in it that could be inserted into a player piano. This is the granddaddy of MIDI. It's sending note on and note off information in a certain order, and most player piano systems had other places on this sheet to control things like dynamics and pedaling. The player piano industry blossomed in the brief space between the rise of the commercial music market and the rise of recording technology. If you're Nancarrow and your goal is to hijack this mechanism to create things humans could never play, you really have to be committed. He was outside the academy, outside the mainstream, outside the Overton window, outside the country, outside of writing for anything or anybody traditional. Yeah, he kept 12 notes to the octave, but otherwise he was starting from scratch. Between 1947 and 1983, Nancarrow wrote exclusively for the player piano, in a series of about 50 studies. The numbering is neither consistent nor chronological. Some were renumbered, others pulled, most aren't precisely dated, and many of them were first called rhythm studies, until Nancarrow realized how redundant that was. Nancarrow said that the first 20 or so pieces were him feeling his way, largely to get a sense of limitations of the player piano and what working methods worked. It was unlike traditional composition. He was already pushing the limits in pieces like the sonatina or the toccata, which are now more often heard in transcription. To get his feet wet with the roll-punching machine, he started with his sonatina. But soon he was on to writing original music directly for the player piano, conceived with all its inherent advantages and significant limitations. His work is both highly specific in its instrumentation and title, and wildly varying in content. Some of the studies are in multiple parts, some are transcriptions of other pieces, but almost all of them are colossal tidal waves of notes that fully exploit the player piano. It can produce many dozens, if not hundreds of notes per second. Nancarrow tops out around 170, 175 notes per second at his wildest, and this is all well and good, provided the lines keep moving and you don't repeat a note too quickly in time. Because if two holes that represent the same pitch are too close together on the paper, the machine interprets this as a held note. So the pitch content in places like study number 25 was limited. Nancarrow couldn't risk returning to any pitch too soon lest he interrupt the flow. Friend of the show Kyle Gann, in his amazing book on Nancarrow's music that was a primary source for this episode, writes that, with the arguable exception of study number 49, there is not a piece in Nancarrow's mature output that does not contain some new idea or twist he had never tried before. From his earliest surviving piece, a saraband for two winds and piano, Nancarrow was obsessed with counterpoint, and especially canon. He prepared for his player-piano era by writing music that used canonical techniques and independence of lines. Nancarrow wanted to leverage the player-piano in canonical forms. The volume of notes in a Nancarrow piece required some new tricks. Lines moving at different speeds have to switch off at certain points, lest the material go so far out of whack that the canon falls apart. Most scholars, Gann included, really helpfully include diagrams that visually describe the nature of the canonic material. Different layers will either have vastly different textual and rhythmic identities, or will be doing the same thing at vastly different rates. Gann puts Nancarrow's canons into two eras. The first used low tempo ratios, like 3:4, because he wanted to hear the result. It's experimental music. He was curious. As time went on, he used ever larger ratios, creating totally new textures at the cost of our ability to hear the canons as easily. As the ratios grew larger, the more Nancarrow was interested in those points where the voices came into moments of synchronization. Ironically, the less you can hear the canon in a Nancarrow canon study, the more you can really hear these moments of convergence, and his treatment of materials highlights these convergences. The collision of these lines, their individual character, and relationship to one another, or lack thereof, is what Nancarrow scholarship is mostly about. You'll see terms like temporal dissonance and temporal friction to refer to this aspect of things. In addition to Gann's book, there are several very chunky dissertations, sources as always down there in the doobly-doo. Nancarrow's approach to canon began in earnest with a subsuite of studies he called the 7 canonic pieces, which are studies 13 through 19. All unified by the same numerical relationships. Number 15 is the simplest, since it is apparently physically playable by a single human. Virtuoso pianist Ivar Mikashoff did it, and it exists as a Mikashoff transcription for two hands that other pianists have tackled. Mikashoff also did various transcriptions of studies for various ensembles, all of which I like a lot more than the Nancarrow originals. I think the music is richer when it's played by humans, and the rhythmic layering pops, even if it's not quite as accurate. Nancarrow's early studies are bluesy, and he also uses a lot of ostinatos and simultaneous tempo layers. This also manifests in isorhythms, a somewhat related concept from medieval music, which you can think of as kind of a rhythmic ostinato. In medieval motets that use this technique, the rhythm and the cycle of the pitches would be of different lengths. So clever use of isorhythmic technique in study number 20 creates a hazy fog of broken arpeggios. Now you might wonder if Nancarrow's music in this age of MIDI is perhaps more portable. And the answer is a qualified no, because timbre is important, and he tinkered with the piano mechanisms. The first piano he got came with something called a mandolin attachment, common in coin-operated player pianos. This is loose metal looped into leather straps, all attached to a movable wooden board. And while it was okay for most commercial applications, his music was a lot more stressful on the instrument, and the mandolin attachment kept getting snagged. But this gave him a starting point for his two preferred preparations: steel straps and clothing snaps, directly on the hammers. The difference between these instruments is really noticeable in the two piano studies. He admired the harpsichord, and he would have written for player harpsichord if such an instrument existed. So he did his best to replicate the envelope of a harpsichord sound on the piano. Something that's strong, it's buzzy, has a really noisy attack, and a very quick decay. In study number 12, which Gann calls the Spanish study, the arpeggiated blips that Gann hears as flamenco guitar flourishes, I hear them almost like a video game sound effect. It's so fast, it's so precise, you hear more of the transient sound of the attack than any sort of pitch. And that's intentional. That's the direct result of what he put on the hammers. Like, there's a reason that felt is the common covering for the wood on standard piano hammers, because like the chances of this hitting a string hard enough to break it, I mean, it happens, but it's extraordinarily rare and usually indicates a problem with the structural integrity of the string or the tension that's on it rather than the force itself. But if this is just a much harder material without any, I mean, this doesn't have that much give, but if it doesn't have any give at all, then over time, yeah, you're going to have some problems. To finish off the harpsichord sound, he also put extra dampers on the high register and almost never used the damper pedal. He only uses it in study number 25. His approach to dynamics, too, was pretty baroque. He preferred to specify discrete steps along a spectrum instead of using the player piano's built-in gradual crescendos and diminuendos. Dynamics could be specified on each half of the keyboard, so to get around this limitation, Nancarrow opted for octave doubling, so that slower lower lines could stay as pronounced as faster higher ones. He had to account for the fact that his preparations limited the decay of each of these sounds. When this music is played on modern MIDI-enabled concert grands, which can happen, the pieces sound noticeably different and noticeably worse. I should point out that this uniform hammer alteration isn't a preparation in the strict John Cage sense, although Cage was a part of this, as Nancarrow had attended the New York premiere of Cage's Sonatas and Interludes for prepared piano. Cage's preparations were about objects wedged into or laying on the strings, and gravity works against you on an upright, plus the strings are just harder to access. He would write only one piece, Study 30, for prepared player piano, but this was for grand piano, and he said he had such a hard time keeping the grand working that he eventually gave up and sold it. In many cases, pitch is an afterthought. I don't want to say that Nancarrow didn't think about pitch, but some composers are really pitch first. In Nancarrow, they're more like something you need to illustrate the process, to give the canons, to give the proportions, to give the multiple tempo layers substance and beef. If you want to define layers through Spanish or Gregorian or boogie-woogie affectations, some of that's going to be rhythm, a lot of that's going to be rhythm, but a good chunk of that's also going to be pitch. It's helpful. In study number 21, called Canon X, after its structure of gradual acceleration in one voice and gradual deceleration in the other, Gann points out that there's no way for Nancarrow to have determined ahead of time what might line up between the voices in this process. Whatever pitch stuff he could have done wouldn't have made a lick of difference in how listeners understand the work, or why people choose to listen to it. So, why bother? Now, study number 21 is where I think the studies really get interesting. For most of the studies numbered in the 20s, Nancarrow played with acceleration and deceleration, with each note's duration expressed as a percentage of the preceding note. Usually, if you want to accelerate in Western music, you can write the word accelerando, which gives the performer license to speed up, usually in a short time frame and often to a target new tempo. Absolutely barbaric. You could get more precise by writing out the acceleration in note values, but that's a subtraction by an absolute value each time. If you're working in whole notes, that's 16 16th notes, and if you take away a 16th note each time, you're taking away 1/16th of its value. So the next note is going to be 15 16ths long. If you take away a 16th note from that, you're taking away 1/15th of the total duration, then 1/14th, 1/13th, and so on, and eventually you're taking larger and larger cuts. That's not smooth. That's more exponential? They say music is math, but math was never my strong suit. Don't know what that says about my musicianship. There's no easy way to convert Nancarrow's smooth, percentage-based accelerations into traditional notation, because notation just doesn't operate on percentages. His machine didn't either. Percentage-based rhythmic composition was so radical that after punching study number 21, he reconstructed his punching machine because it came with these little notches that forced you to punch into a grid. He also added a way to punch 4 holes at once to make longer notes more feasible. Working in percentages doesn't just give you a neat way to hear how time flows in music, it opens up a new world of possibilities within canonical form. By altering the percentage change and starting duration, the voices of a tempo canon could start at any point relative to one another and still line up at the end, or line up wherever you wanted them to line up. And to that end, the acceleration studies are some of Nancarrow's finest mathematical achievements. Number 22 is a 3-voice acceleration canon. The lowest voice speeds up by 1%, the middle voice by 1.5%, and the highest by 2.25%. Number 27 is a canon at 5, 6, 8, and 11%, set against eighth notes that anchor us to a traditional perception of time. Nancarrow stayed under Cowell's influence for a long time. In his study number 37, he took Cowell's ideas about pitch and rhythm and used that as the basis for a 12-voice canon, where the tempo relationships between layers are the same as the 7-limit just intonation chromatic scale that Cowell proposed in New Musical Resources. The bass tempo corresponds to C, and the other voices are in alignment with Cowell's ratios. Gann says the Cowell giveaway is the distinct 15 to 14 ratio of C to C sharp instead of 15 to 16, and I gotta say, Kyle really knows his tuning theory. So Nancarrow wasn't just picking numbers out of a hat, he was experimenting with consonance and dissonance in rhythmic relationships. player piano, you could turn precise frequency ratios into tempo relationships. A canon with 5 notes in one voice to every 4 in the other conceptually overlaps with the 5-to-4 frequency ratio of the just major third. So in a way, you can think of it as a canon at a rhythmic major third. Actually, don't. That makes it sound confusing. So the thinking goes, if these ratios create more consonant and dissonant intervals, they should also create more consonant and dissonant polyrhythms, or in this case, tempo relationships. So Nancarrow started by applying consonant ratios to his tempos, and then slowly cranked the complexity. Study number 33 uses the very dissonant equally tempered tritone, which means a square root of 2 is here in play, while studies number 40 and 41 go into irrational constants, pi and e in study number 40, and the square root of pi in study number 41. Daunting math, I'm sure. I just don't think they really sound out that complication, and I'm not alone here. These forms of irrationality are never supposed to coincide if they start together, but there's wiggle room in our perception. There are plenty of points of perceptual convergence where the notes sound like they're sounding at the same time, even if there's only one point of true mathematical convergence. 2 notes can only be so close together before they start to become a harmonic entity. For study number 41, where the ratio is, I'm just going to show it because I'm sure not trying to verbalize this, Nancarrow recalled that a mathematician once wrote him a letter telling him how he could simplify the formula and get a similar result. But that wasn't really the point.
The important thing is to understand what you're doing rather than to get the right answer.
Working with complicated prime factors led Nancarrow away from sketches using traditional notation. The bigger the prime factors, the more untenable it becomes to figure out where the bar lines would line up, so he took to making templates of cardboard that correspond to particular tempo ratios. Jonathan Wilkes, in his Nancarrow dissertation, points out that the templates allowed him to use multiple tempos and then decide how the musical material could work with or against the inherent points of rhythmic unison. Being able to clearly see the placement of rhythmic articulations must have been incredibly helpful in planning some of the most striking features of the studies, Wilkes writes. Nancarrow knew how long a piece would be and his minimum note value before anything else. To hear him discuss it, putting in the notes is a later, less important, and almost perfunctory part of the compositional process. To that end, Nancarrow could be surprised by his own work when he put the finished roll on his piano. The templates would mark a grid into manuscript paper, which was the basis for a punching score, which was in turn the basis for the rolls. Each note was at least 1 punch. Longer notes would take a great many punches, and each punch took such a great effort that James Tenney reported Nancarrow's left arm was much beefier than his right.
I'm just gonna go and check my mail over there.
The process from beginning a study to the final roll took many, many months. Nancarrow didn't need to make the final scores that we have. The pieces exist on the rolls. But even in his exile, there was a part of him that wanted to be taken seriously. The process of transcribing the first 30 player piano studies in something like traditional notation took the first 5 years of the 1960s, a period where he didn't write anything new. He just worked on transcription, he got depressed, and he also studied Chinese. Sussing out the rhythmic layers has to be done with a ruler, and even Gann, who again literally wrote the book on this music, says that the only way to really properly figure out what's going on is to look at the piano rolls, especially because the final scores Nancarrow provided later in his career are somewhat sloppier. Nancarrow's luck began to change right as the trust fund was running out. Peter Garland, the composer behind the Soundings Journal, got wind of Nancarrow's whole situation and made the pilgrimage to Mexico City in 1974, which began a series of publications in the journal. Thus started a decade-long period of the world discovering Conlon Nancarrow. All his completed studies were recorded, 32 of the scores were published in Soundings, and he won a MacArthur Genius Grant in 1982. Betty Freeman was a major source of funding, commissioning new pieces and new arrangements, footed the bill to renovate his punching machine, and donated to Soundings so Garland could keep putting Nancarrow's scores out into the world. Georges Ligeti got his hands on the first recordings of this music, and not only did he call Nancarrow the best composer then living, comparable in revolutionary importance to Ives and Webern, but legend holds that he copied the records of the cassette tapes and handed them out like an evangelist. "You have no idea," Nancarrow wrote to Garland, "how famous I am becoming in Germany."
Germans love David Hasselhoff.
The 70s were also a time of personal happiness. He met and married the Japanese anthropologist Yoko Seguira, and they had a son, David, in 1971. Nancarrow said that having a wife and child made him more amenable to performances and international attention, as he wanted to leave them something. With this surge of interest in his music, there was interest in getting Nancarrow back to the United States, to move for professional and health reasons. The smog and altitude of Mexico City was rough on him. Eva Soltis became his manager, and she got Nancarrow a 5-year visa starting in 1981. And towards the end of that time, dragged Nancarrow to see an immigration lawyer. Because of his youthful communist ties, any hope of repatriation would involve being openly anti-communist for 5 years and submitting an official mea culpa to the United States government. Though he'd long since abandoned the revolutionary fervor of his younger self, he would never betray his old principles, so he had to stay in Mexico City. At the time, by some metrics, the world's most polluted place. He had to rework his studio in the 1990s to cut down on the dust that was aggravating his emphysema. The studio was so built for him, it was almost a part of him. Moving it, he said, would condemn him to a life just trying to get it to be all right somewhere else. Nancarrow was not exclusively a player-piano composer, but you'd be forgiven for thinking that he was. After all, that was the central period of his creative life. A large chunk of his experiments into other media never saw the light of day. He did some musique concrète experiments with percussion, and that went nowhere, although the tape still exists. He tried to build an automated percussion orchestra from a player-piano mechanism in the late 40s, and in the mid-50s, that was when he acquired his second player piano, but neither of these projects went anywhere fast. He didn't have the technical skill to sync anything up, and in that era, I think you'd have to have been an engineering genius to figure it out. It took until the 1980s for him to use 2 player pianos in the same piece, and even there, though, he didn't try to sync them up. One of Nancarrow's justifications for the player piano was that he didn't like the idea that pieces had to have different interpretations every time, saying that, well, Shakespeare's sonnets don't change. I mean, they have actually changed a little bit across publications, but also accents change. People have different intonations. They emphasize different things, their pace. It's the exact analog to the interpretation of a Beethoven sonata. That's also a work that undergoes slight changes between printed editions, but at the core, it's the same. They just have many different interpretations. People have their favorites of these interpretations. As nonsensical as I find this particular example, I hope you can sympathize with the desire for precision above everything else. That was a trend in 20th century composition, and most of these composers use synthesizers to get there. So why didn't Nancarrow join them? He openly envied how quickly they could make changes. Well, for one thing, he was well into his player piano era when the first big synthesizers came online at elite academic institutions. He was iced out. He said he might have worked with synthesizers had they been around earlier, and he was open to MIDI once it came along, at least as a tool of preservation. German-born sound artist Trimpen helped Nancarrow in that project, and for one of Trimpen's inventions, Nancarrow wrote his late piece Contraption No. 1 for Trimpen's Instant Prepared Piano, which features computerized application and removal of preparations on piano strings in real time. Nancarrow didn't think he was writing for specialists, and once considered removing the spelled-out tempo relationships from his scores As he said, it just seemed to confuse people. And when you confuse Elliott Carter with something rhythmic, you know you've done something kind of impressive.
This is big brain time.
Performers get better and better with each and every passing generation. And while it's not physically possible to play many of the studies, basic tempo relationships are within reach as new music specialists encounter rhythmically challenging music. Ivan Mikashov's commission, Tango, was a turning point in the number of commissions for human performable pieces versus new player piano studies. Within the decade, Nancarrow wrote to Garland that he was afraid he'd have to drop the player piano bit, no money in it. He committed decades of his life to something that he was now, I think, ruefully calling a bit. He felt limited by humans, completely spoiled, to use his words, by the player piano. He kept his working method, but now had to consider things like conceptual and physical limitations, and most of the time he'd just end up making player piano versions anyway, because that's how he envisioned them. The human performance would always be a simulacrum of the true performance, idealized in his head and realized through the player piano. Playing other rhythmically complex music is good brain training for playing Nancarrow live, and since basic tempo relationships in the low to mid single digits are now within the realm of reason, for the esteemed Art 80 Quartet, Nancarrow wrote his third string quartet. This one has a 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 tempo canon in each movement. The really novel thing in the third quartet is his notation of accelerando. The finale is an acceleration canon notated by showing their lines in relationship to a bass tempo. Nancarrow died in August 1997, and his effects in music are still being felt. He's kind of a cult favorite, to be honest. He's one of these composers who gets talked about and revered a lot by those who came to know him and his work and appreciate the magnitude of thought that went into each creation, the sheer creativity that flowed out. He never really did the same thing twice. But predictions that he would be lauded as one of the all-time greats so far have yet to materialize. Perhaps it's because his work was so far beyond what Western music had ever done that it'll take generations for his vision to be fully integrated. This phenomenon of inflexible materials and elastic results, wrote Roger Reynolds, is at the heart of the contradictory and unique world of Nancarrow's music.